be invited to do this because it's the first time that I had an opportunity to develop a talk about the days that I recently spent in France, and I certainly thought I knew a lot about French clock and watchmaking, but as we always find out when we actually go to places, there's probably most of what we think we know we don't know. And this was an opportunity for me to learn more about French horology and to then share it with you folks. So I'm happy to do this. I'm still sort of warmed up because I was at the National Convention in Lancaster. I was the James Arthur speaker at the symposium there, and I also did a talk about horological illustration during the regular convention, and I'll be mentioning that briefly as we go along. So let's start with when we landed in Paris. We were there just briefly before we headed out to Eastern France, but this just shows you, you see that red dot over on the right-hand side, that was the home of the fellow we visited. You see the Arc de Triomphe down on the left, so you get a little sense of where we were in Paris. And this was the fellow on the left that we went to meet, Stefan Adler, who I learned had just doing a fine, amazing new thick book about French clockmaking, and he received a gold medal from the French government for this book. So it was he was an important guy for me to meet. He was a friend of a friend. So we stopped and had a nice lunch and visited him in his great apartment in Paris. And this is the cover of the book that he prepared. It's in French and Greek, so I can read some French. I can't read any Greek, but I was still happy to have it for the wonderful pictures that you'll see in it too, because the theme of this book was really how he did some very important original research connecting classical French clocks from the early 1800s with their artistic sources. So in some cases, he was able to find the design drawings for the clocks. So several of the illustrations and pages he have where he discusses where he, as you see on the left, he found the design drawing for the clock, and then he had an actual example of the clock. He owns about 150 clocks, French clocks of this style, early 1800s, with classical themes of Greek and Roman themes. So these are all his clocks, which he then spent years going to French libraries and archives, tracking down the artistic sources of them. Here you see another example too. A lot of these have great titles. This is the title of this actually means kind of the infidel. So this is the Turks responding to how they viewed the Westerners who were coming east to Istanbul. And some of them actually relate more to stories of the past, and they recreate the images from prints and paintings. So in this case, this is an old story about these two lovers. So you see a print on the left, and then the clock design that derived from it on the right. And this is another example of a sad Christian in the Middle East somewhere, I believe. And then you see the same image on top of the French clock on the right-hand side. And this is a Mamluk, one of these Turkish soldiers, I believe. And you see, again, this was clearly the design of the figure on the right was clearly inspired by this artwork on the left-hand side. So one of the main reasons we went to France was because I've always wanted to go to Besancon that you see circled there. This was a major center of clock and watchmaking in the past in France. And every year in June, they have a meeting and a mart of the French equivalent of the NAWCC. So we took the fast train from Paris down to Besançon. But I also wanted you to see this because you see just to the right of Besançon are the Jura Mountains, and then Switzerland. So you may know or recall that the Jura in between France and Switzerland was a very important place for early clock and watchmaking. A lot of those farmers had long winters where they could do other things when they couldn't be outside. And this is a travel poster. Again, you see the word Jura down there in the bottom right, showing these mountainous village areas in eastern France and in Switzerland, where a lot of clock and watchmaking happened in these villages a couple of centuries ago. And probably everybody who has dealt with French clocks at all knows the name Japy Frère. So there is picture of the factory. So Japy Frères had two factories, both of them out in the Jura area, not far from Besançon. And this is a early photograph of the Japy, one of the two Japy Frères factory, which produced all those round movements that I'm sure many of you have seen inside French clocks for 150 years of that production. One thing that I had learned along the way too is that Japy Frères didn't just make clocks and watches. You see, this was a page from the one of the Paris exposition reports, this one from 1889. And Japy Frères was also showing agricultural equipment like this seed drill that you see here. This was on my title page, and that's because in Besançon, they actually had a self-guided walking trail, and these were markers embedded in the sidewalk so that you could walk from place to place that was horologically important in Besançon. There was plenty else going on there too, but they're very proud of their history. This was one of their schools of horology. They were training clock and watchmakers by the thousands there to continue their domination of horology in that area. So there's one of the old schools. That building still exists. You can see it there. There's a restaurant in there now that has a name that's, of course, related to clock and watchmaking. Temps means time. So it's a nice building clock there in the center pediment of that building too. But there was an even larger School of Horology too in Besançon that you see here, again, with a nice big clock up in the entrance of the building. So, and this is a picture of some of the students of the watchmaking school. You see their instructors in the middle, and a lot of young men who I'm sure went on to great careers bent over their watchmaking and clockmaking benches in that area. And there are several important firms, not always ones that are familiar to us, but they are ones that we should know and can know if we study French horology a little bit more. So this is a great picture of Piguet, of their establishment in Besançon, their storefront. I'd love to be able to zoom in on that first floor front window. It's probably full of all kinds of great things that we'd like to see in bigger detail. And here's just another one of the Besançon watch companies, Jean Benoit. So, some of these may drift across our mart table sometimes. We don't see as many French watches as in other places in Europe because not a lot of them came here. But again, there were many brands of them too. And if you want to study more about this, this is an early 1904 book by the famous horologist Charles Sandoz. And he wrote kind of a whole book about the rich watchmaking history going back almost to the 1400s in that area of France. The other great thing about Besançon is that on top of its hill overlooking the city is the citadel, this huge fortification that was created by Louis XIV's famous engineer, military engineer. So this was an important place. It had belonged to the Spanish. Louis XIV conquered it and built this great citadel up top there. And there's a lot of museums. There's a zoo up there and all too. The river, as you see, runs through it. But in a small museum there, they had a display of early iron implements and machinery and tools that were made in Besançon. And this is an example of a roasting jack that they had on display there for turning the meat in front of the fire. There's another smaller spring-driven version of a roasting jack too. You see the French name of it down below on the label that you see below there. So also important in Besançon is their cathedral, which you can approach going up a hill. There's its clock tower, but just as important is inside the clock tower. I'll show you in a minute. This is my wife who is with me, and this is Johannes Graf, who's the longtime curator at the Museum of Horology in the Black Forest in Germany. He's a good friend of mine now. He came to speak at a couple of my symposiums, and he joined us there for the day in Besançon. So we're and this is the museum that he is the major curator of in the Black Forest. I certainly hope some of you have been there or will get there. Just don't go after the middle of next year because it's going to be closed for a couple of years while they redo the whole interior of the museum. But this is what's inside that tower down below is a monumental astronomical clock with thousands of parts, dozens of dials that show all kinds of things. And it was connected. It's not functioning now, but it was connected to the bells in the church. But it just shows incredible amounts of things. This is a view from the back. I got the little red-headed girl in there just to give you some idea of the scale and the complexity of the movement here. See, and here's let's see, and here's another view, just standing in the other direction. Again, you see a guy through the opening there to give you a sense of this unbelievable astronomical complicated clock that sits at the bottom of that church tower. And there's the little entrance. For a while we had trouble even finding it or finding how to get in there for the little tour they gave, but finally we did, and there am I and Johannes Graf leaving after we had our tour. The other good thing about that weekend, in addition to the Mart and all, is it was a whole weekend in Besancon related to time and timekeeping and all kinds of events that related to time and all too. One of them, you see my wife Jean there on one of these bikes, so you could get on the bike and roll along and see how fast you could do it. And again, all related to timekeeping for the theme of that weekend in that city. The Mart was sponsored by the French equivalent of the NAWC. It's AFAHA, A-F-A-H-A. They put out great publications. They have these marts like we do several times a year around France. The one in Besançon is an important one. And there's the view of the mart that I was happy to roam around in and look at the kinds of things that they had for sale there. So it reminded me of an NAWCC mart, but a lot of French stuff that we don't see. And of course, everybody speaking French, which I limp along at, but can do okay. You know, everybody says, well, what did you buy there, Bob? I can't say I came home with any amazing things, but in the €1 each bucket of watchmaking tools, I had to poke through there for a while, and I found some interesting old tools. I love these old tools because they just speak to me about the watchmaker and clockmaker who was holding these and perhaps using them for decades or even generations. And now I can maybe commune with them spiritually in a way by holding their tools. So I was happy to at least come home with these souvenirs. This fellow is a leader of this association of Comptoise clocks, and I'll speak more about those a little bit later, because obviously this was the area where all these Morbier clocks came from. They didn't come from the Paris clockmaking tradition. They came from the Girard, from the Eastern tradition too. And you see the book there on the side there, and I bought that book. Again, it's in French, but it's probably the best book that I've read, and I have a few others about Morbier Comptoise clocks, but this certainly tells the whole story, full of great illustrations. Something else that I was able to buy there, some guy had a whole stack of these original catalogs from this manufacturer of clocks in that area of France. So I was able to buy one for about €5. The thing that was amazing to me is that this catalog is from 1931, and they were still producing the type of Morbier and Comptoise clocks that we associate with the 18th and 19th century. So in 1931, you could buy clocks like this brand new. So I've certainly serviced some of these. Maybe some of you in the audience have as well. And we all assumed, yeah, they must be from the 1800s. But you could, again, in 1931, you could buy a new one of these. So they were certainly a successful design that went for centuries, and you could still buy them in the 20th century as well. But more important in that area is their Museum of Time. It's an incredible museum full of all types of watch and clock history from that area. Part of that whole celebration that weekend was in the courtyard of this museum. It was actually a palace of one of the most important guys in France, and certainly in that city. The museum only occupies about half of the building, the palace, because they haven't restored the other half yet, but they have plenty of stuff to expand into that whole building when they can. So there's one of the floors of the gallery of that Museum of Time in Besançon. So you see some things there. We'll zero in on some of them. The clock and watchmaking tradition certainly went well into the 20th century. You see some of those Atto clocks there that were electromechanical as well as watches. But they also had a 15th century tapestry there. This again was huge, probably 20 feet high almost. And I always scan these because sometimes I find horology in them. So if you look up at the left above his shoulder, you'll see a clock on the wall of this tapestry, and there's a close-up of it. So my searching is always ongoing for looking for clocks and watches and artworks, including tapestries. And once in a while, I'm rewarded with finding them, such as in this early tapestry. So just to look at some of the wonderful early clocks that are in this museum. This is a monstrance clock, very, again, 1500s probably from that time period. These wonderful orrery clocks from that time that are mechanically driven, and the planets move around as powered by the clock. There's a globe clock with the way the movement looks inside. There's cases full of sundials that you see here, including a very early stone carved one over there on the right. And of course, displays of all kinds of early clocks, both from this area and some from southern Germany as well, where they originated, and of course, very early watches as well. You see one here close up, and certainly Breguet is one of the most important names in French horology, and they had several examples of his work, including this subscription watch, which he produced single-handed, trying to make watches that were more affordable than the more exotic, complicated watches that he was producing for the royalty and the nobles of France at that time. There you see some escapement models, a great carriage clock too in the case. Certainly a very early one-handed clock from there with the front and back movement that we're familiar with, a lantern-style clock. And of course, they had a lovely early tall clock as well too, all iron frame. Before clockmakers were clockmakers, really, they were often iron workers or blacksmiths whose side job was making these clocks for the cathedrals and church towers of Europe during that period. I was happy to see a clock by Tio because he's a maker that I'm familiar with. There's a close-up of his dial. He's a Paris maker, not from that area of France. But I'm a member of the Grolier Club, which is an important early club of book collectors based in New York City. And I have some things on exhibit there now, including this 1741 book by Tio. So he was a scholar, an expert on horology, as well as a clockmaker, and he produced this amazing book. You see one of the fold-out engravings there, and there's another one that comes from that book. So, we think that we're pretty advanced and smart now in the year 2023 with what we can make. But think about this, in 1741, they were already doing these complicated things. What we're looking at here, as you see up top, is that this is about the equation of time. These were systems built into the clocks, which enabled them to show how much faster and slower the sun was compared to clock time, even back roughly 300 years ago. They were able to create these complicated devices. And I love these horological illustrations, and that's another talk that I do. I did it at the symposium last year in New York City, and I'm happy to come back and do it for you at some point, just to show that there were amazing artworks essentially created by illustrators demonstrating how clocks and watches worked and the various parts and tools that were in use at that time. Here's a nice, again, horological illustration that's on the wall of that museum in Besancon. So here's some more examples of some early clocks that you could see there. Of course, I spent a day there, could have spent a few more. I met the curator. She was very nice. I hope to bring her to America someday to speak to some of our chapters when we can. There's kind of another example of some great French clocks that they have, more like in the Paris ones with those round movements that Japy and others were making in France. But of course, they focused and had a big display of Morbier Comtoise clocks. So they had several examples, covered the whole history of them from the earliest to the latest. You see a whole array of them standing there in those shapely cases, not just the more typical English or American ones that are more rectangular. They have those interesting Bombay cases often, or other types of cases that were a little bit more decorative. There's some more examples of them, some with those big fancy pressed pressed brass or cast brass pendulums as well, and plenty of movements for us to look at too. You see in this display, you see a great movement down at the bottom. And then in the middle is the earlier style with the cartouche numbers in enamel or porcelain. And finally, when they were able to fire and create big single porcelain enamel dials, you see how the styles morphed into that once they could figure out how to fire big dials like that without them cracking or falling apart. So that was one of the ways that you can date Morbier Comtois clocks is by the styles of those dials. They also certainly wanted to show the type of equipment that was in use in those factories and by the watchmakers themselves at that time. So you see some of those, a great movement holder on the left side, a little fancier than the one I've used on my bench. I'd love to have that one. But they have great. So here's the that Atto, the close-up of those clocks. I have an example of those. I've never been able to make it work because I'm not as good an electrician as I am a clockmaker, but they're fun to look at. And when they do work, they're great. They're nice and quiet too, and they keep good time. One thing they have there is they actually claim to have an even earlier super complication watch that has more complications even than the ones that we know about from Packard and Graves. So this is Leroy #1 that was produced for a collector there, and it's now in the museum. Some of you may know this book by Stacy Perman that was about the Patek Philippe super complication watches made for Graves and Packard, those guys competing on who could get the most complicated one. But in that museum was one that was preceded that and was just as complicated, even came with this box that had extra mainsprings, had extra dials depending on where the watch was going to be used. So that was a great thing that came along with the watch. That was one of the dials, the front dial showing the complications, the thing that it does with the explanation, and then the back dial also showing the stars, the constellations above the city where the collector worked, and all the times in these various cities around the world. So a lot of parts in there, a lot of complication in this watch. Is you can only see it if you go to Besancon in France to take a look at it. Of course, they had marine chronometers as well. As you may know, the French made them just as much as the English and Americans did. There's a Leroy one, again, that same maker as that complicated watch. And here's another one, which you see has a 24-hour dial marine chronometer. So that was interesting to see that. And you know, we had these have the up-down indicators, but as you can see, we see the French words for ba and o as opposed to up down. And you can see this also they see the label up above the chronometer that this was serviced by Leroy. So we still have that Leroy connection there as well. Of course, they had sort of super accurate astronomical regulators for observatories and all too, including those Riffler vacuum sealed clocks on the right hand side. And of course, some very exotic other kinds of clocks too. That's an amazing temperature compensating pendulum by Breguet that I'd not seen before. And it's a mystery clock too, where that pendulum swings back and forth mysteriously, but with that mercury filled tube compensation in there as well. There's a dial of a Breguet that they have on display there. And of certainly many watches that were made in that area. You see the map above showing this area, La Chaux-de-Fonds, Neuchâtel. Those are all names we know from Swiss watchmaking. And there's several examples of watches there. One of them was LIP, L-I-P. Maybe once or twice I'd heard of that watch name before I went there, but that was one of the major watch manufacturers in Besançon at that time. They even made electrically wound or electrically driven watches. Here's an example of 4 of their early electric watches. And they apparently had an argument with Einstein, because here's one of their ads showing that they don't agree with relativity, or that time is relative. They say it's absolute, and their watches keep absolute time. So I thought that was a fun advertisement that they came up with as well. So as we're leaving Besançon, heading back to Paris, this was in the train station. So I'm not sure if it's the world's largest clock escapement or not, but it was functioning, and it was on the wall of the modern train station that's there just outside of the city. So when we arrived in Paris, we came into the Gare de Lyon. That's the train station that services that part of the country. And of course, they have a nice big clock tower, as most train stations everywhere do. But more important, when I was looking for a hotel for us to stay in, and I found that there was a hotel on this street, and what better name for a horology enthusiast to seek out than to be in a hotel in Rue Breguet. And actually the hotel was Maison Breguet. So even better, of course, I had to steal a couple of pens from there that say Maison Breguet on them. But it was a lovely small hotel with one of the most important names in French horology, and even a local subway station has the same name on it as well. But one of the most important museums in the world for horology is this art and métier, which means, arts and trades. So I spent many hours in there too. There's these wonderful cases full of the earliest and most important examples of French horology. I'll just show you some examples and mention a few as we go along. Of course, they had a noon gun there too. It was pointed right at me, but luckily it didn't fire as I was looking at it. So another one of these wonderful globe clocks where the globe actually turns and indicates the time. And there's the interior again of a movement of another globe clock that they had on display. Some beautiful other examples, multi-dial, a multi-dial example of clocks there. This is a tellurium, a type of globe clock also. And Janvier, some of you may know, is one of the most important names in French clockmaking as well, but he made all types of instruments, including this wonderful early 18th century thermometer. And you see he even included the sort of some record-breaking cold and hot temperatures in Paris. So you see below, that's how cold it got in 1709 and 1740, and then the heat in 1753, the high points. It would be interesting to find out. I bet that in the recent heat waves in Europe, they've actually exceeded that now. But this shows that it was getting hot and cold in Paris during those years as well. But some of us may not recall that Berthoud was just as active as Harrison was in producing highly, highly accurate marine chronometers, this time for the French government and the French navigation. His were weight driven. He couldn't or thought that it was possible and perhaps more important to have them weight driven rather than having to deal with fusees and differences in temperature changes of springs and everything. So he was and power differences in springs as they ran down. So that's why you see these cylindrical marine clocks that Berthoud made. So here's the way it looks from a side view, and that wonderful gridiron temperature compensating system that he had in there as well. That looks like one of those big gridiron pendulums on French clocks, but this was incorporated within the temperature compensation system of these marine chronometer movements from the early 1800s. So there's, again, more display cases. You see one of those chronometers again in its gimbals on the right side, but other wonderful examples of the highest end French horology sort of centered. You see one of those Rango orrery clocks too that drives the movements of the planets above the dial here too. So of course, many watches. If you look at this one, you can see that this was made during the time when the French Revolutionary government was trying to impose decimal time on France. So there were clocks that showed both. So you see this is a 24-hour dial with 12 at the top and the bottom, but the time also advances from 1 to 10 on the inner dial. So they were covering both time systems. As we know, that didn't last very long, but there's a lot of great early watches that show decimal time as well. They also have a recreation of Berthoud's workshop. So you see his desk there, there's a pastel drawing of Berthoud there, and that big instrument on the right that I'll show you more closely in a minute was important. Here's some of his tools that he used. Again, he wasn't working by candlelight with just a couple of files and screwdrivers. He had certainly extremely sophisticated equipment, even more than 200 years ago, to produce the kinds of things he was doing. So this is the close-up. This was actually his shop regulator. So this is what he would use in part to time the marine chronometers that he was working on as well. So you see another case full. So again, some of his chronometers, other important, interesting French timepieces. This case had some amazing things in it. If you look some multi-dial things. These elaborate cases. But on the left-hand side, you see a clock, and you'll see a close-up of that. Here's a little more better close-up of it, and you see that it has two dials. That's because that clock has two pendulums. So if you were able to look at it from the angle and closer, you would see that there's one pendulum behind the other, and each pendulum had its own dial and seconds bit indication. So this was a Breguet. You see the number of it. And this was, again, trying to reach supreme accuracy. If you have two pendulums, they kind of work in unison, and you can see if they're keeping time together with one another. Here's another Berthoud dial, and as you see again, this goes from 1 to 10. This is and has the 1 to 24 on the inner dial. So this again was decimal, made during the French Revolution. So again, some more exotic French timepieces, including another mystery clock there, Figaro, where the pendulum just moves around seemingly magically. Great multi-dial as well. Another view of the galleries in this museum in France. They also had one of the few recreations of the Dandy clock. We know the original one from the 1300s disappeared centuries ago, but he gave such detailed drawings and explanations of it that few people have been able to recreate accurate reproductions of it, and they had one of those there as well. In other cases within that museum, other horological tools and equipment that, again, were kind of beautiful to look at, as well as to speculate on the fine work they were able to do. A great gear cutting engine with its index plate down below. Another great tool that, again, just lovely to look at, even if you were never going to use it. They're wonderful artifacts from that period. And of course, there were several other technologies and trades in that museum, including this airplane hanging in one of the bigger rooms. And that airplane was made by Breguet, a descendant of Breguet. So, and this is another Breguet airplane. So that's again something that I was able to learn, is that Breguet was not only famous for watchmaking, but a descendant also during World War I was making airplanes as well. So another stop in Paris was the Decorative Arts Museum near the Louvre. We walked by the huge long lines of people waiting to get into the Mona Lisa, and walked into a nearly empty museum next door, which to my mind was full of far greater wonders than the Mona Lisa. So including this wonderful portable clock, and cases full of beautiful clocks from that period as well. An amazing tall clock. I certainly have never seen that style before on a pedestal. I suppose somebody had this in their living room, but I've never seen one here. And of course, lovely examples of these classical Figaro clocks as well throughout this Decorative Arts Museum in Paris. Here's one recreating Montgolfier and the balloon ascents that he pioneered, and became famous motifs for all kinds of decorative things, including clocks like this. As we were again walking around Paris afterwards, we passed by the National Archives and saw that they were having an exhibit on Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI during the Revolution. We thought we'd pop in there. This is the inside of another, of course, beautiful building in Paris, and full of some great. Here's a Lapote mantle clock as well that we admired. A room with another regulator with a gridiron pendulum standing in the corner. But what was most exciting is that they described the close relationship between Breguet and the royal family. So there was an exhibit related to Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI and their watches. And they actually had the Breguet ledgers, the original Breguet ledgers, showing work that was done for Marie Antoinette during the time that she was a prisoner, before she and her husband were beheaded, were guillotined. For a few years, she was a prisoner in Paris, but her life went on, and she continued to have things repaired and dealt with, and Breguet was still working for the royal family. So here's a page, close-up page of that ledger, and you see the word French, the word for watch is montre, and you see I've underlined a few cases in the Breguet repair ledger where he was working on watches that, as you see below, you see a tombé, that means the watch fell. and the dial was broken, cadran est cassé. So he had some work to do on that watch that either tumbled accidentally or on purpose, and then Breguet had some more work to do to repair it. So as we're getting near the end of the talk, one of the other things I wanted to do, very important for me to do when I was in Paris, was to visit Anthony Turner, who lived just outside of Paris, about a half-hour train ride in this little town that was a place where there was a small mansion of the king. That's what that town name means. And this is the town hall, the mayor's residence, as we were heading over to see Anthony Turner. And here's a picture of me in just seeing a part of his library. He has about 15,000 books. He's also for decades has been a major dealer in horological books, rare books, horological books. And I had met him once briefly, and we've communicated by email, but it was very important for me to meet him, spend time with him. And he kindly invited me and Jean out to his home for lunch and to look at some things and give me an opportunity to buy some things, which I did. But he also invited Catherine Cardinal, who, again, is one of the most famous horology experts. She was a curator at the Museum of Time, both in Paris, the ones I showed you pictures of, and then later in La Chaux de France, one of the world's biggest horology museums there for more than 10 years. And she's, an incredible expert, many books written by her, and it was a wonderful opportunity to get to meet her. The most recent book that Anthony Turner has produced is this big 700-page General History of Horology, published by Oxford University Press. He did most of the work here. You see some other names that I know as well, but he was mostly responsible for that. And there's just one of the books that Catherine Cardinal produced while she was at the Museum of Horology in Switzerland. So you see her name there down below. So that wraps up my talk here. I can say that when I was introduced, I was mentioned that I'm a livery man of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers, and I take opportunities to go to London when I can. This was one of the livery dinners that Jean and I went to a few years ago, and we're going to another one in November. So anytime you'd like to invite me back to talk about English horology or horology illustration, any of those subjects, I've got many things that I love to talk about, many things that I've been fortunate enough to learn and visit during my life of horology. So I'm happy you invited me, and I'm happy to have this chance to revisit France from a visit I made there just a few months ago. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So Jeff's going to handle any questions. If you do have a question, please stand so that we can capture your voice on the technology here.
Well, it looks like I just overwhelmed everybody, right?
Great talk.
Okay.
Bob, could you talk a little bit about your hunt for artwork and photographs and whatever that have include pictures of horology?
Yeah.
And then you always had each issue of the part, the bulletin, you had a photograph or whatever about the things that you had collected. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yes, thank you. That's one of my sort of most intense passions, and I do some great lectures on that too. Again, if you want to hear that one, I could do it now, but I'm sure you want to you want to invite me back another time for that. More than 20 years ago, I noticed in a Christie's catalog a Renaissance era picture of a woman holding a watch, and I said, what's going on with that? And it sort of sparked my interest in trying to find artworks by famous artists as well as by lesser known ones where there's a clock or watch in the image. And I began collecting them as digital images. As Jeff mentioned, I now have, I think, 2,300 of them, even though I can go to a museum or go to or go to an auction and never find one, but I look hard and and now I have a pretty good collection that goes all the way from Leonardo da Vinci to Rembrandt, all the way up to artists of today. It just continues to excite me when I spot one, and I keep going at it. I have a collection myself of some artwork too, and I've had 2 exhibits already. One at the Willard House Museum, where I showed about 50 of the original artworks that I have, both paintings, old prints, some posters from long ago as well that I love to have. And then also at the Horological Society of New York, I also did an exhibit there with again an equal number of paintings and prints and things too. But obviously I don't own any Rembrandts, but I have plenty of pretty pictures of wonderful early paintings that have them in there. I call them eye candy. I love them, and I love talking about them too. So it's something that I'm certainly not done with, and I'm hoping someday even some major museum, in Boston or New York City or somewhere will want to have an exhibit where they bring out their, major paintings and can be included in an exhibit like this. The thing that I find out too that's frustrating is that a lot of art historians and curators, they'll look at a painting where there's a huge clock dead center and they talk about everything except the clock. And, it always puzzles me. And I think part of it is that they're afraid of saying something wrong, or they're afraid somebody like me is going to say, oh, you didn't say the right thing about that clock. But it's just astounding how many times, there'll be this major painting. A recent example, and I even wrote a letter about it, was there's this wonderful picture of Queen Charlotte, who was the wife of George III of England. It's a great painting of her, famous painting of her in one of her chambers. And there's a beautiful tall place clock against the wall behind her, made by Crescent in London. It has equation of time, all kinds of stuff on it, gridiron pendulum. And there was just recently an article in one of the in the London Review of Books that I get, talking about that painting. An art historian was talking about how important this painting was and how it was full of all these wonderful things that were surrounding the Queen when she was sitting in her chambers there. And it didn't say one word about that clock. And this sort of happens time after time. And I guess part of my mission, and I guess I did it by writing a letter to the London Review of Books, which they published, was saying, hey, by the way, probably the most valuable thing in that painting of the Queen's riches was that clock that you didn't say a word about. So that's the story. But again, I'd be happy to on another time show you a lot of art eye candy that's full of clocks and watches. Thanks for the question.
What site had the best collection of tools?
Say that again. Yeah.
What sites had the best collections of tools for horology?
Yeah. Every one of those places that I went to and showed you some pictures of probably had, more tools than I'll ever see anywhere else. So, I didn't just show you the only ones they had there by a long shot. So I think anywhere you went, you would see those kinds of things. The Museum in Paris of Art and Métier, it means art and trades, so they are not shy about showing how all these things were made and how and the tools that were required to do that. The Decorative Arts Museum, they weren't that interested in showing you tools and equipment, but these trade places like in Besancon, like in Paris, just as important to them as how these things were made as much as what they looked like when they were done. So I think you'd find them, but I probably saw just as many tools in that mart that I went to in Besançon too. If I'd had a steamer trunk with me, I could have come home with a lot of those same tools and machines that I saw in those museums, but I might not have been able to afford my flight home if I'd bought as many as I saw there. But again, it's just such a great opportunity to see those things. Our marts, as you know, tend to be full mostly of American and English stuff. And the French were doing a lot of important horology too that I think we're just not as aware of, because a lot of important French books have not been translated. Even when you go to these French museums, the labels are not in English. So we're not always sure what we're looking at too, or the books, the catalogs of what's in those museums is not done. But of course, another important place that I was a few years ago is the Museum of Time in La Chaux-de-Fonds in Switzerland. That's probably the biggest horology museum in the world. And again, that's packed full of all kinds of stuff, including a full-size automaton of, I forget if it's Breguet or Berthoud, an actual a guy, who moves, who sits at a bench with all his tools and he moves and talks to you. So, but that's not very far from Besancon. If you're in that area and you go to the IMH, as it's called too, you can, you'll see amazing things of how they were able, to make a watch with an equation of time function in 1760. But thanks, good question.
Thank you.
Over the years, how metallurgy was important in these kind of things. Where do they get the metals? How much has it changed over the years? Do you have an idea about that?
Yes, because I mean, as you saw, and maybe the earliest clocks were made of iron, and when iron wheels run against iron pinions, they wear out pretty fast, and it didn't take them long into the 1500s to discover that the marriage of brass and steel, or brass and iron, was a better combination and reduced wear. But brass was quite expensive and difficult to produce until maybe the 1600s, when you could buy brass somewhat affordably and be able to make it into timepieces. Of course, their alloying, processes were not that good. So you could end up with not only casting occlusions, but if you had too much copper or, too much zinc or whatever, you would end up with an alloy that perhaps was too soft or too hard, or, too brittle. But the metallurgy certainly was a huge part of it, going right up into the late 1800s and early 1900s, when they actually, with Guillaume, developed Invar and some of those alloys which wouldn't expand and contract to the same extent that steel and iron would, for temperature compensation. So certainly, I like to say, and maybe we're beating our own drum here, but the horologists, the guys making clocks and watches, were the smartest guys around. They had to know a lot about everything. They had to be mathematicians to compute time trains. They had to be metallurgists to know what metals to use and which ones weren't going to last. They had to be scientists to figure out, the equation of time things, and how to do astronomical observations. So metallurgy was a huge part of it, and most of the, especially the early ones who had to produce clocks through a guild, they had to produce a masterpiece. They had to make a watch or a clock from scratch. If they used the wrong alloy, they weren't going to pass, and their clock wasn't going to work. So metallurgy was hugely important, and there are people who've studied this a lot. I just was reading about this, oddly enough, in a related book, because it was an amazing transition from like the 1500s to the 1600s, when they could stop just trying to make iron work with iron, and they incorporated brass, and it made a huge difference in durability and accuracy.
Question I have, I'm a big guy on word origin. So the word horologian in Dutch is watch. So is that a French word, or is it a borrowed word from the Dutch language?
It's originally with Latin. It originated in Latin. Horos, was the god of time and all too. So, but as probably a lot of when sometimes when you say you're a horologist, people are a little worried about what kind of business you're in. All right, if we warn them out.
Any more questions? George?
Just gonna say, Jeff, that I hope we'll invite you back again, Bob, and give talks on a variety of subjects, including the one about collecting all the artwork and so forth. It's your fascinating talk, and it's been wonderful to hear all of your experiences and all the places you've been. So, fantastic.
Well, thank you. And when I did a little run through of our trip for another people, I also included the 2 weeks we spent in Japan a few months earlier, and visited some great horological sites in Japan as well. I was able to get an early Seiko after going to the Seiko Museum in Tokyo. So and talk about things we know almost nothing about, let alone French horology. Japanese horology is fascinating and very different. So I'd love to pull together a talk on Japanese horology for you too sometime.
All right, well, we enjoyed having you and thank you for giving this fascinating presentation.
All right. Thank you. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day. Sorry I'll miss lunch. Okay, bye-bye.
I will reiterate our appreciation, Bob. Oh, we lost him. Okay. And thank you to Jeff for arranging this and to Bob for making all the technology work. It opens up such a vast opportunity to hear from folks, and it's almost as good as having the person stand right in front of you since we can interact with them. So thank you very much.